The next section of this video is about family violence and children.
The negative impacts on children's well-being, their mental health and development and learning potential has been shown to have devastating effect by being exposed to violence and abuse within the family.
Those things stay with us more or less for life. They can be altered to a degree later on, but it's very difficult to do that. So the focus really needs to be on preventing that early damage.
The effect of family and domestic violence begins or affects the child in the womb. It begins from that point.
The psychological effects of family violence on people varies upon many factors, including the frequency, the duration, and severity of the abuse, age of the victim, type of abuse, and so forth. However, we know that when a person is experiencing abuse, they experience stress, and the body reacts by producing a chemical called cortisol. This chemical, cortisol, is a stress hormone, a substance naturally produced by our body's adrenal glands, and elevated cortisol levels can build up in the blood and become toxic, leading to serious health issues.
During pregnancy, the stress levels from mom get passed to the baby through the blood. With a newborn baby, the stress levels get passed through the breast milk.
Maternal stress releases chemicals and hormones. All those changes go through the blood system and goes to the unborn child.
If you're pregnant and you smoke cigarettes, you drink alcohol, or you take drugs, it's also passing through your bloodstream, through your body to your child, and that's going to have an impact. Family and domestic violence is not that different.
So whatever affects the mother, stress-wise, physically or biologically or psychologically, has an impact on the unborn child. So the transmission goes on biologically.
This misconception in society when we talk about family and domestic violence, just because the baby is unborn, it doesn't mean they've been exposed to it. No. The effect of family and domestic violence begins or affects the child in the womb. It begins from that point.
Now, when you think about a child that is in utero, in their mother's womb, essentially, the mother is having a response. So those chemicals are being released.
You're passing those stress hormones or those chemicals through the bloodstream to your child.
If we think for a few moments about the fear response. So if someone yells at you or attacks you or threatens to hit you or punch you or kick you or cut off a part of your body, you're in a fear response. So if someone yells at you or attacks you, you're in a fear response. And what's going on in your body is not just those chemicals and stuff, but we're talking about muscle memory that happens. So my shoulders become tense, I start to have tension in the back of my neck, my major muscle groups are tense, they're ready for action. That's what we call fight, flight or fear response that happens in all animals.
And this is coming from the brain. The brain actually perceives danger very, very quickly. It sends signals to the body. You either get prepared to either run away from here or you fight this.
Our body takes over and responds to keep us alive, really, in those situations. So it has this sort of threefold mechanism. So it includes the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands, as a way to respond to the stressful situation. We've got the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland here, which are part of the brain, and then we've got the adrenal gland, which is near the kidneys. And this makes up the HPA axis. This HPA axis is set up to help us respond to stressful situations. The three systems work together to help us cope. The messages get sent around, so you're ready to run or to fight.
When the flight or the flight response is activated, your brain goes into either fight the situation or flee the situation. This is where your stomach pumps the adrenaline that you need if you need to run, and your heart rate increases, and you become sweaty. Your focus becomes very narrow on whatever is causing you threat.
Women who are pregnant and live in domestic violence situation, whether it's physical violence or other forms of violence, are always living in a fight or flight conditions, which means that their anxiety is very, very high.
So hyperarousal is what we're talking about in terms of those cortisol, adrenaline levels that are elevated all the time.
The higher the cortisol levels are for the mum, the higher those levels will be for the baby.
The reality is that our system is not built for prolonged stress. This mechanism works, with the idea that the stress or the threat will pass, and then the body goes back to a state of equilibrium.
Normally what we would see is that people going along, daily life, something fearful happens, you get a bit of a peak, and it comes back down at the end of it. So, I'm driving my car, for example, we have a bit of a, need to put on my brakes, those things go up, but it's all okay, an accident hasn't happened, we pass through it, and my levels of those hormones go back down to normal functioning levels. In people living in ongoing situations of violence, be it actual or threatened violence, that we know, and we know this scientifically through research, through medical evidence that's gained to show that those levels stay high almost all of the time.
And this is prolonged, then it changes our genetic makeup. It changes how our brain and our body works.
That ongoing heightened fear response, releasing all of those chemicals in our body, which in turn makes our brain develop in a different way to how it's otherwise designed to.
This HPA axis will be altered in such a way where he or she will have a very heightened sense of alertness and creates a kind of a constant anxiety. We are built biologically to respond to short-term stresses. We need to recognize that a negative impact on brain activity changes the genetic imprint in our DNA and makes us more vulnerable.
We constantly read that stress and anxiety and people who are living in constant stress, whatever causes the stress, the impact of that the stress has on your body, on your health, on your mental health is significant.
If the mother is experiencing high levels of stress, the unborn baby will naturally be experiencing if not higher levels of stress.
And the mother is probably also not sleeping, getting good enough sleep. Those things are severely impacting the development of the fetus.
When you are in a flight or fight condition, what happens is the blood is going to your external parts of the body, so your hands, your feet. You're not having a proper blood flow to the baby, to the child. So that impacts the unborn child quite sometimes significantly. So we can get children with very low birth weights, some birth defects. Miscarriage is higher with victims of domestic violence.
We can observe these effects as well in newborn children. So moving on to kind of that 0 to 1.
Newborn babies, if the cortisol levels have been high for a lot of time during the pregnancy, then you basically get an anxious baby who's born anxious.
Infants who experience domestic violence are often characterized by poor health. Number one, their sleeping patterns are all disrupted. So when you've got two parents who are living or experiencing domestic violence, it's going to impact on the sleeping habits of the child.
Young children need huge amounts of sleep, you know, from babies literally requiring 22 hours of sleep a day to 3-year-olds, you know, still as much as, 14 hours of sleep per day.
Because babies sense what's happening around them. If they sense that the mother is in constant distress or a trauma situation, it distresses the child, which means that they are constantly crying. They're crying, the sleeping is very bad, they may not be breastfeeding properly.
If hormonal levels are not right, there's often not going to be healthy breast milk production from the mother.
Sometimes when mothers are living in domestic violence situations, okay, their body may sometimes even not produce breast milk.
Without proper sleep, for the body's ability to rest, for the brain to rest and grow, we see a lot of negative effects in regards to child development. So what we know is that things like IQ is severely impacted by the amount of sleep children get. That process of engaging through the eye contact and through touch with the child is that process of bonding and attachment. When a mother has an infant, the infant is held like this. Yeah, it's held like this. It's held in different ways. It's held on the back. It's close. It has a physiological proximity to the mother in young children. And that is continuing that attachment that's happened in utero in those early years. So the child still sees themselves as part of the mother.
We know that an infant's attachment to a caregiver, that attachment is fundamental to the development of this child.
Through the attachment, that connection, let's call it connection between the mother and the child predominantly in the first instance. It also happens between the father and the child. It happens a little bit stronger in the mother because the mother tends to be doing much more of the holding in normal circumstances, for example, like breastfeeding. So the child is held, the child is looking up at the mother and the mother is ideally looking down at the child.
And when that is disrupted, this can have, all sorts of problems, developmentally, physiologically.
If mum is in an ongoing situation where there is violence or the threat of violence in the domestic environment on an ongoing basis, that affects her forming those bonds of attachment with young children. That eye connection, particularly that visual connection between the mother and child, is what is forming those early neural pathways. Those parts of the brain that are forming in relation to what's going to help my body function well later in life, both now and as I grow, as my body physiologically grows into adulthood.
We know that the younger the child experiences trauma or violence or any kind of disruption to the normal environment, the greater the effects are on their development and later on consequences in life.
That a child in those early years that grows up in a home where there is fear or actual violence going on a regular basis, that their cortisol levels are up, their adrenaline levels are up, that's impacting their healthy physical, their brain development, and that is and will result in them not reaching their full potential in terms of intellectual capacity. We suspect that also this sort of trauma, those chemicals being around in the body, will impact even people reaching their full physiological potential.
Then the child starts to grow up in an atmosphere that is insecure for them, and the children sense that very well. Then even that can affect their growth, their child developmental growth. And then it affects them, emotionally, mentally, as well as psychologically and physically as well.
It's possible that we might see people not growing as tall as they might have reached otherwise. They might not reach the same muscle mass. At times, violent people will say, well, I've never hit my kids. So my violence has never been directed at them, so they're okay. And what we know is that they're not okay because, of course, they have a close relationship with other members in the family. For example, the mother, if they're observing mum to be violated in some way or they see her fearful all the time, that has an impact on them.
The children do understand in their own way, in their own infant way, they do understand because of the looks on the father or the looks on the mother, and then the smiles on the face or the angry facial expression.
Actually, seeing their mother being harmed, they could be forced to participate and watch the assault. It could involve a child having to patch up their mum after a violent assault. So there are the various ways a child can be exposed to the violence and the abuse that's happening.
The child knows, can sense what's happening, and if the child feels unsafe in that environment, then it will start producing behavior problems.
And then we've got the preschoolers who tend to sort of develop more behavioral, social issues, and that's just because when their sense of security is being disrupted. One of the ways we see that is in their development of their social skills.
So they would have all sorts of problems, the attachment problems, they would have behavior problems, socially they wouldn't be able to deal with situations.
One of the things that we observe in preschool aged children is that their ability to grasp new concepts, their ability to concentrate, their ability to sit still and listen to someone in a teaching situation.
And then when we get to the school age, because the school age is when children develop a sense of the world outside of the family. Maintaining friendships, making friendships are particularly important for school age children. And for school age children who are exposed to domestic and family violence, often they look towards role models and connections and friendships outside of the home to develop who they are, sense of who they are.
Kids who live in domestic violence situation means that they've experienced a lot of conflict at home. They are bringing that conflict with them to the school. They may experience a lot of conflict in their relationships with other children. They may not have proper conflict resolution skills. In fact, some kids at that age may have absolutely no conflict resolution skills, which will then have quite a significant psychological impact on them. Some of those children only know how to use violence to gain control of what they want.
If the child actually finds it very difficult to relate to even himself or herself, and then they will naturally find it very difficult to relate to others, including the teachers. And in that aspect, their learning potential is being impacted. They'll find it very difficult to pay attention to instruction or being observable to learning materials. So it affects their own learning perspective as well as their own progress in life.
What your parents model to you, okay, will become normalized. It will become normalized. The most impressionable ages are those of the very early childhood.
It becomes a family pattern. It becomes a pattern from learned behavior, to implementing behavior.
If they observe behaviours in those loved ones around them, which are violent and controlling, the message is clearly that they're learning that those behaviours are okay. It's also at that stage, that entering into adolescence, that we see teenage boys and at times teenage females as well starting to become violent towards the mother.
The way they later, when they grow up in life, they start to interact with other children. And sometimes they develop, some personalities that they have seen.
There's a much higher probability of male children who grow up in homes where they have observed and been aware of violence happening, of them becoming perpetrators of that violence themselves, essentially learned behaviour.
It's like they continue the domestic violence, pattern all throughout their life from generation to generation.
When we reach to the teenager age, it's important to recognize that whilst not all adolescents exposed to domestic violence will grow up to repeat the offender's actions, a percentage of teenage children, when they go into adulthood, will only know as to what was demonstrated in front of them. So it makes it makes a very fertile ground for the continuation of the cycle of violence in many ways.
If the child, from the time the mother is pregnant, that child already has been sensing stresses from the time, the child is in the womb of the mother. And then the child is born in an environment that is insecure, that is full of violence, that lacks love or understanding or cooperation, family cooperation. And then that child grows up, from even the day the child was born, and then grow up in such a home whereby there is no laughter, there is no happiness, and there is no good communication skills. The child, grows up gradually and graduated to an angry person, a frustrated person, that in time will find it very difficult to address their issues, maybe when they start schooling or enter university or start work. They might find it very difficult to work with other people as a team, to be cooperative, or they lack the simple aspect of good communication skills.
Research has actually confirmed that people who have experienced long-term trauma, and that equals to stress, have heart disease problems. A lot of them die very young, have developed diabetes type 2, high blood pressure, all kinds of physical chronic diseases compared to the non-traumatized populations.
So early childhood stress has a very long-lasting impact on children.
The focus really needs to be on preventing that early damage that's done in those formative years.
If you are experiencing family violence, you are strongly encouraged to seek help and talk to someone. If you feel threatened, you should contact the police on 131 444 or, in an emergency, 000. Another important number is that of Crisis Care, a 24-hour free telephone service that have trained staff who can advise you about the various options you may have concerning family violence. Crisis Care can also link you to various government and community organisations who offer services to men, women and children regarding family violence and other related concerns. Your local community legal centre can also assist you with further information. We hope this educational video has been of some assistance to you and your family, and that you and your family have a happy and healthy life here in Western Australia.
We sigh, we cry, we hurt inside, feeling the pain. We know it shows when sadness flows, falling like rain, when there's nothing we can do, when our world it turns so blue, when the sunlight fades away, and all we can do